You are listening to Breaking Boundaries with Brad Palumbo.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the show. I've got a great guest with me here today, Corey DeAngelis. He's Director of School Choice at the Reason Foundation and one of the most prominent voices out there speaking in favor of free market school choice education policies and reform. Corey, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
So I guess we should start with kind of the nuts and bolts of this issue, right? Because you and I are both plugged into it, you extremely so, and it's a pretty popular mainstream issue, but a lot of people might not understand the specifics. So just in the simplest sense, what is school choice? What do we mean when we use that phrase?
Yeah, a lot of people get confused about the phrase school choice. So I've started to talk about it in terms of what we actually mean, which is funding the students as opposed to the system, or funding the student as opposed to the institution. So all it really is allowing the child's education dollars to follow them to wherever they're getting an education. That could be their residentially assigned traditional public school, or what I refer to often as government-run schools, or it could be a charter school, it could be a private school, it could be a homeschool option, it could be a micro school, it could be a pandemic pod. So it's really just the idea of having the money follow the child. It's their money. It might as well follow them to wherever they're getting an education. But that's the broad definition of how I would talk about school choice or funding students directly.
So the two ways that I know that come to mind for me are what's known as voucher programs, where the state gives people basically the money that was supposed to be allocated for their education from taxpayers, instead of just going directly to the school, the local public government-run school, it goes to the parents, who can then send it to a private school of their choice, a charter school, their local public school. And then there's also just the charter school expansion aspect of it. So can you flesh out those kind of different forms of what school choice looks like in different places?
Yeah, so charter schools are defined in state and federal, and by the federal government as well, as quote unquote public schools, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, because they can be privately managed, but they're public in the sense that they're publicly funded through taxpayer funding. They are heavily regulated by government and oftentimes need to be authorized by local districts or local governments. And so they're kind of a quasi-public private option, but in general, and they have to abide by the federal education laws as well. So that's like another reason why they're defined as public. And some people call them private just because the one aspect that they can be managed by private entities. So they're quasi-public private. And in general, they have to accept all students by random admissions. And students are not generally residentially assigned to charter schools. So they're defined as public schools of choice in that sense.
So let's talk about the school choice as opposed to what? The status quo of public schools, right? Where I grew up, you pay your local sales and property taxes. Those go to fund your local school, and that's where you go. It's based on your neighborhood, your address. You have no other options. If you go to that school and you're getting bullied and they don't do anything about it, there's nowhere for you to go. If that school is falling apart and absolutely sucks, tough luck. And if it's a great school, well, then you're in luck by virtue of your zip code. Yep. So can you just maybe describe what the status quo of public schooling looks like in terms of what school choice is not?
Yeah, you essentially hit the nail on the head that in the traditional system, people live in a particular residence and their children are assigned by their residents to a particular school. And in that sense, public schools aren't really public in any meaningful sense of the word. They're not available to the public like a public park where you can just walk and if you want to go to that particular park, you can. In fact, in the traditional public school system, families have actually gotten sent to jail or fined for lying about their addresses to get their children into better quote unquote public schools. They're also not public goods. They don't meet either definition of a public good. You know this. You're the Foundation for Economic Education, but they're excludable and they're rivalrous. This is one of the main reasons why we have private schools that can exist today, because they can exclude non-payers from entering the building. And so that's the status quo. And the main problem with that is that it creates a large degree of monopoly power. Just imagine if you were residentially assigned to your nearest grocery store or restaurant. They wouldn't have any particularly strong incentive to do a really good job because they know that they get your money regardless of how well they met your needs. And so that's the same problem we have with K through 12 education, is that it creates this residential assignment creates a geographic monopoly, but then we also have compulsory funding through property taxes, which creates both of these things together create a large problem in that there's huge transaction cost associated with picking something else. Essentially right now, if you want to exercise school choice, you either have to be rich enough to live in the neighborhood that's residentially assigned to a better public school. And if that doesn't work for you, you have to get up and move houses, which is a huge endeavor and really costly endeavor. Not cheap. It's a pain in the butt. Just imagine if you wanted to switch your grocery store and you had to move your house. I mean, the grocery store might have worked for you for a year or two, and then something might have changed, management might have changed, and imagine you had to get up and pack your bags or pay out of pocket for another grocery store while still paying for the grocery store that you were residentially assigned to. That's what we do with the public school system. If you want to pay for a private school or switch to a private school, you have to pay out of pocket, but you still have to pay for the public school despite not using it through the property tax system. So these families are essentially stuck paying twice. And the least advantaged families are the ones that are going to be the least likely to be in a position to access these types of alternatives in the current system. So in that sense, funding the students directly through allowing students to choose other options like charter schools or giving them the money to spend at a private school they're choosing or in the home is an equalizer, because it allows more families to have these types of educational options. You did ask about vouchers, but I want to get into magnet schools too, because I went to a magnet school in Texas where I grew up in San Antonio for high school. And it's kind of like a charter school in that you're not residentially assigned to magnet schools, but they are still government run. So that's the main distinction between a magnet school and a charter school. And magnet schools can have selective admissions. They can require certain entrance test score levels and certain behavior from your previous behavior records from your previous school. And so they do have selective admissions. Not all of them do, but in general, charter schools are not allowed to do that. And what's interesting is a lot of people will claim that charter schools don't take all comers. They don't educate all students, to which I quickly reply, well, magnet schools don't do that. You don't have a problem with that. Is it just because it's a different owner? It's the government running it rather than a private entity. And then two, the traditional public schools don't educate all students either. And even the students that they do have attending them, a lot of them can't really say they're actually educating the kids if they're not producing the right results. Okay, so voucher programs. This is the idea pushed forward by Milton Friedman in his 1955 essay, The Role of Government in Education.
The GOAT.
The GOAT. But he wasn't the first person to ever talk about voucher programs. I have to make that clear because a lot of people confuse that. It's just in modern times, he is the person that most people associate with voucher programs because of this 1955 essay. But John Stuart Mill talked about the voucher idea in On Liberty in chapter 3. Thomas Paine talked about the voucher idea in the book, The Rights of Man. And then also we had voucher programs in America in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont in the 1800s. So this has been going on a long time. But the idea put forward in that essay by Milton Friedman was just what I talked about earlier. You're residentially assigned to a particular school. In the current system, your child's education dollars goes to that school regardless of their satisfaction with that school and regardless of whether you want to be there, regardless of whether you even actually pick that school. In the voucher idea, some of that money, a fraction of it, usually it's not 100%, but let's say it's like 50%, depends on the state. That money you'll be able to take that in the form of a voucher to a private school of your choosing. That's it. That's the voucher idea. The money follows the child, but in general, it can only be used at a private school of your choosing. That's why I push for education savings accounts. It's the same idea. You're residentially assigned to this school. A certain amount of money can follow the child, but instead of coming in the form of the voucher, the money can go into something called an education savings account. And you could just go and take that money to a private school, but you could also take it to use for other tutoring expenses, homeschool expenses, online learning. You could use it at the private school if you want, but it allows for more customization. It really brings us from school choice to education choice, because schools are only one form to attain one channel to attain an education. And so I think education savings accounts are the gold standard of education choice, which is funding the student directly.
So let's talk about this a little bit in terms of how the national debate has played out over the last decade, because school choice is an issue where conservatives or libertarians or right of center policy tends to favor school choice in terms of our elected officials. However, when you look at the polling, Democrats and African Americans and Hispanics, and they all overwhelmingly support school choice. And actually, I can think of the one example of Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida was put over the edge in his election by African American moms who support school choice, if I recall correctly, and wanted him to protect their great system that they have down there. So this isn't something that's really determined at the federal level. This is kind of a state and local issue. So how widespread is school choice right now? Is it in 5 states, 10 states, 45 states? Like, what is the status of the fight right now as it stands?
Yeah, I want to point out really quickly that you're right, that if you look at several different demographics, people overwhelmingly support the concept of funding the students directly, or what you would call school choice. But then when it comes to the elected officials who are currently in office, the Republicans are a lot more likely to vote yes on these types of programs, whereas Democrats, there are some exceptions, but in general are much more likely to vote no. And it shouldn't be like this. I mean, in 1990, when the first modern day voucher program in Milwaukee was passed, it was a bipartisan effort or nonpartisan effort. It was supported by a Democrat, Polly Williams, and other Democrats in the area, because they understood that school choice is an equalizer, that advantaged families already have school choice in one form or another. And they saw this as an opportunity to improve equity. But it also, Republicans can get behind it because of the arguments for competition and for several other reasons and other fiscal reasons as well to support the school choice measure. But as far as school choice today, we have about half of the states which have some form of private school choice initiative, either a voucher program, tax credit, scholarship, which I haven't even explained yet. We don't have to get into that, but it's a way to privately fund school choice mechanisms as opposed to taxpayer funding through the state education budget or an education savings account. And then as far as charter school laws, I believe it's about 47 states have, and the District of Columbia, and the District of Columbia also has a private school choice program as well. But almost all states have charter school laws in place. And the first charter school law was passed in Minnesota in 1990 or 1991. The first modern day voucher program was around that same time in Milwaukee. But as I said earlier, we've had some town tuitioning voucher programs that were in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont since the 1800s. And I think as far as private school choice programs, we have about 65 private school choice programs in place today, but I will say they are mostly targeted to small groups of students. And so although the number of programs has gone up a lot over time, especially since 1990, over the last 3 decades, the percent of students using private school choice programs is only about 0.5% of the amount of students in the traditional public school system. So it's not a lot. It's between 0.5% and 1%, but it's not huge. And then as far as charter schools, about 5 to 6% of the school age population is currently attending a public charter school in the U.S. So we're making strides.
There's a lot of kids out there who currently do not have access to school choice, or at least aren't utilizing it.
Yeah, and when you ask people over and over again, what type of school would you choose, or what type of setting would you choose if money weren't an issue? There's polls done on this, nationally representative surveys done on this, it seems, every year. We had one from EdChoice just earlier this year that asked, what school are you in now? Where would you send your child if given the option? About 83% of children are in government-run schools today. But when asked this question, only about 33% on the latest poll said that they would actually choose that. So if people were actually given true choice, you'd probably see a mass exodus from the traditional public school system or government-run school system. And this is important because Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation for Teachers, the second largest teachers union in the United States, likes to repeat this over and over again, that 90% of our kids are in public schools, so we should focus on where all of those kids are. And we should devote one. It's like, well,
that's circular.
Are you saying that the needs of a small group or a minority those aren't important? That's not the stance you want to take. But then two, like, okay, yeah, 90% are there, but that's not even true. It's 82 to 83%. She combines charter schools with government-run schools and calls charter schools public to inflate her number. But then when she's talking negatively about charter schools, she says that they're private schools. And so you can see this dishonesty. But the bigger point here is, well, yeah, I mean, you have a monopoly and a lot of people are forced to use your product. That's not really meaningful. How many people would be there when they're truly given the option? Well, it looks like it's about half of the amount that are less than half of the amount that are currently in those institutions.
So you made an interesting point earlier that I think is actually one of the most compelling arguments in favor of school choice. I forget exactly who it was. It might have been Tommy Schultz at the American Federation for Children, but he basically just made the argument to me that, you know, wealthy families already have school choice. It's not a big deal for them to pay their taxes and then also just pay to send their kid to private school or get their kid into a charter school. They're the ones that already have all of this. So by pushing to expand school choice or educational choice, right, because it should include homeschooling and other options too, conservatives and libertarians and right of center reformers are actually looking to expand options to working class people, to minorities, to middle class people, to poor people, whereas the progressives and the teachers unions that back Democrats overwhelmingly and have a lot of financial sway, they're really looking to enshrine a status quo that prevents those people from having that choice and traps them into a system that doesn't really serve many students well. So I guess the question I have for you, Corey, is how does the U.S. stack up internationally in terms of, are these public schools that so many kids are school trapped in, are they really failing us? Like, what does the evidence show on just how the American school system is faring in the status quo?
We're number one when it comes to spending more than anybody else, or we're in the top handful of countries as far as spending per child. We spend about $15,424 per child per year in the U.S. Overall, and that number, after adjusting for inflation, has increased by 280% since 1960. It's nearly doubled since 1980. It's increased by about 40% in real terms since 1990. So we throw more and more money into the system without getting any meaningful improvements in results. And if you look at our international comparisons on the PISA exam, for example, we're about middle of the pack. I think we're about 30th to 40th in math and reading. But what I think is really important about what you just said about the main argument that for school choice is that this equity argument, and how progressives are for some reason not supporting it at the moment. I want to point out why I think that might be, and something that I've seen to be a huge logical inconsistency when it comes to opponents, or at least mainstream opponents of funding the students directly or school choice, is that I compare school choice to a lot of other programs that fund people directly, such as when it comes to higher education, we have things called Pell Grants for low-income students to attend public or private schools of their choice or universities of their choice. We have the GI Bill for veterans. The money goes to the family or the student, and you could take that to a public or private, religious or non-religious university of your choosing. Same thing with pre-K programs. We have Head Start, a federal program, and there are many state level programs as well, where the money goes to the student, or the family at least, and the family can choose a public or private provider of pre-K. And a lot of the people who support these programs and funding students directly when it comes to higher education and pre-K, they get all up in arms when it comes to the in-between years, and it just doesn't really make any sense. Why would you support funding students directly for this level and for this level, but not for K through 12? And the only reason that I can come up with is that the power dynamics differ. When it comes to higher education and pre-K, choice is the norm. But when it comes to K through 12, choice threatens an entrenched special interest that profits from getting your children's education dollars, regardless of how well it meets their needs. So you have the teachers unions fighting really hard when it comes to K through 12. You don't have that same kind of battle brewing when it comes to higher education and pre-K. And you can go on and on with these examples outside of education. Food stamps, for example. We don't tell low-income families that they must use their food stamps at residentially assigned government-run grocery stores. And I think everybody would think that that would be absolutely ridiculous and a limitation of individual liberty to tell us a person that just because you qualify for this program, if you want to use that money, you have to take it to a one-size-fits-none residentially assigned government-run grocery store. That would be absolutely ridiculous. And with food stamps, the money goes to the person and the family, and you could take it to Walmart, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, essentially any provider of the service of your choosing. You can do this with Medicaid. Medicaid dollars you can use them at private religious hospitals. You can do this with Section 8 housing vouchers. All of these other programs fund people directly rather than institutions. And I'm just arguing we should do the same thing when it comes to K-12 education.
Let me ask you a quick question for maybe just brief clarification. So we know that politically, teachers unions fight hard, they donate, they lobby against school choice, but it's actually not really intuitive, just from a general layperson's point of view, why teachers unions would necessarily be opposed to charter schools or to private school expansion. So could you explain why it threatens their interests?
Yeah, well, why would Safeway be interested in blocking Walmart from opening nearby? It's all about competition, right? They want to protect their monopoly system. So the teachers unions, they want to make sure as much money as possible is going to their institutions, and public schools are much more likely to be unionized than even charter schools, and certainly as opposed to private schools. So they want people to employ their members, and if they have more members, they can increase the revenues going towards their unions, and they can increase their political power through having a larger voting bloc. And this is also one of the reasons why we see that we throw more and more money into the system, and it actually doesn't even go to teachers all that much. For example, Ben Scafferty from Kennesaw State University looked at nationwide data from 1992 to 2014, and he broke it down by state and saw similar patterns in most of the states as well, that real or inflation-adjusted per pupil education expenditures over that period increased by about 27%, but real teacher salaries actually dropped by 2%. So we're throwing more money into the system. It's going towards administrative bloat, and it's going towards hiring more support staff, but that's not helping individual teachers. And so when you hear things like teachers saying that they have to dig into their pockets to pay for supplies each year, I actually feel kind of bad for them in some cases, because there's more money going towards the schools, but it's not going towards the classroom. And similarly, Education Next summarized data as well from 2000 to 2017. The number of students went up by 7%. The number of teachers went up by 8%, but the number of administrators went up by about over 10 times the rate of students, about 75%. And so again, we're throwing more money into the system. We shouldn't be surprised that it's not making much of a difference, because the schools don't have a particularly strong incentive to spend it wisely, that is, in the classroom on the teachers. And so that's another reason why school choice benefits teachers too. That competition benefits employees, although it might not benefit the teachers' unions. It benefits the individual employees by incentivizing their employer to spend that money on them in a wise manner. And I have to add real quick, there's 5 studies that I know of on this topic, published it at Washington Examiner, I think when you were an editor there. But I summarized the evidence on this. It's called School Choice Benefits Teachers Too. The 5 studies on this topic that I know of all find that school choice competition leads to higher salaries for teachers in the public school system. So a lot of this debate has been around like, oh, school choice, if you're for school choice, you must be anti-public school teacher. No, not at all. Actually, it's the opposite. Teachers are getting the short end of the stick when it comes to K-12 education as well, in addition to families. It would be a win-win scenario for the employees and the consumers of the service, but not for the administrators perhaps in the system.
So let's talk about some common counter arguments against school choice as a movement and as a policy argument and debate. So the truth is, many Americans are supportive of the idea of public schooling. They view it as important for opportunity, a proper role of the government. And these school choice programs, if you are correct, and I believe that you are, that people would leave the public schools and take the money elsewhere, they would defund public schools, right? So would school choice defund public schools?
Well, this is the main argument, right? And I have to add really quickly, shameless plug, that this is my latest book, co-edited with the Cato Institute's Neil McCluskey. There are so many of these myths in the school choice debate that we had to put 12 of them together in this edited volume called School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. I recommend everybody go check it out. But the number one myth is that, quote unquote, school choice defunds public schools, to which I respond, school choice doesn't defund public schools defund families. School choice initiatives just return that money to the hands of the rightful owners, which is the families. The money doesn't belong to any particular institution. Education dollars are meant for educating children, not propping up and protecting a government monopoly. You would similarly never hear someone say, I just think it's absolutely ridiculous. Just imagine if someone were to say that allowing families to choose their grocery store defunds Safeway. No one would even think of that, because everybody understands, well, your grocery money doesn't belong to Safeway, does it? No, it doesn't belong to Safeway or Walmart or Whole Foods. It belongs to the family. So allowing people to have a choice doesn't defund any particular institution. So that's the way that we need to think about it. The way that the teachers union likes to frame all of these discussions as if your child's education dollars belong to their monopoly, which it doesn't in any way. And another thing that I think about when it comes to this argument is that it's essentially, just think about, why would someone say that giving families a choice defunds their institution if they were confident in the services provided by their institution? In this sense, school choice doesn't defund public schools. Public schools defund themselves when they fail to meet the needs of individual families. If you're doing a good job, you wouldn't have to worry about families leaving when given the option. They would stay in your public school. And a lot of the people who make this argument, they'll say, on the one hand, well, we don't need school choice because we already have great public schools in our area. And then on the other hand, they'll say, school choice defunds public schools. Well, which one is it? I think you don't really actually believe the first thing, because you're essentially admitting that people will leave when given the option. Third response to this, because there are so many responses because it's such a ridiculous argument, is that it's a technical point, but in every state that I know of, as far as their funding formulas, public schools, it is true, are funded based on how many students are in the schools, but they're not totally funded based on enrollment counts. For example, in Texas, about 2/3 of the funding is based on the number of students you have in the school. So what does that mean mathematically? When you lose a student to a school choice program, or even if a student just moves to another state, or if they move to a charter school, or if they pay for a private school out of pocket, the financial effect on the school district is identical, is what I'll first say, but then regardless of how you get moved to another school. But then secondly, these public schools actually end up with more money per child left behind, because again, in Texas, for example, only 2/3 of the funding is based on enrollment. 1/3 is not, so that when a student leaves, they lose about 2/3 of the funding, but they get to keep about 1/3 of the funding for students who are no longer there. Just imagine if you left Walmart to go shop at Trader Joe's and Walmart got to keep 1/3 of your grocery bill each week. They'd probably be really happy about that. And so that would be a good deal for them. And I argue that for public schools, they should similarly be happy that they get to keep any money at all. They're profiting on a per pupil basis. Because they have fewer students and they get to keep some of the money. So on a per pupil basis, they have higher per pupil revenues in their schools.
So let's talk about, I think your points are all well taken there, and you certainly won't find me, a libertarian, mad about that point. But I think you addressed some real concerns that other people might have. But here's one issue that has always kind of given me pause about school choice, or that I've heard from people that I talk to in real life who aren't politically active. School choice fundamentally relies on parents. It relies on parents. And I think in many, many cases, it's true that parents know what's best for their child better than the state, better than teachers' unions. That is often true. But I can tell you from firsthand, not everybody has parents who even check whether they go to school. Not everybody has parents that graduated high school themselves. So the idea that school choice works is based on families deciding what's best for their students. But isn't there a large swath of the public, maybe difficult to quantify, but in which parents cannot be trusted to choose what's best for their children?
Yeah, so my first response was what you already alluded to, is that families in general have more information and incentives to get the educational decisions right for their children than government bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away. But that is an in general point. It's not a all the time point, which is what you're alluding to as well. But that is also a problem with the traditional public school system. Those parents will still be able to guide their children through everyday life. And so this is more of an argument in regards to the role of the state when it comes to neglectful parents or abusive parents. Perhaps if there's an issue going on with that, then the state would have an incentive or an argument to be made for the state to come in and correct that wrong. But that's not a school choice issue. It's something that predates school choice when it comes to the issues with the family overall. And then it is true that even if it's not getting into the range of neglect, that some families may, they may make decisions poorly. But does that mean that we take away liberties from families when it comes to any other type of industry in the U.S.? For example, it's possible that families might not choose the perfect diet when it comes to their food stamps for their children. Does that mean that we have, again, families residentially assigned to government-run grocery stores where they say, here, give us your food stamps. We're going to give you your allotted bag of one-size-fits-none groceries that we're going to just give to every single family. I think families can also correct if they do make a bad decision in one year or the other. They can correct these decisions based on the feedback that they get. And then also a similar argument here is that people will say that families aren't education experts, so we should just listen to the education experts. But you don't have to be an expert in a particular field in order to pick certain things. For example, I don't have to be a doctor to choose my doctor. I don't have to be a mechanic to choose where I buy a car or the auto repair shop that I go to. I don't need to be a dentist to choose my dentist. I don't need to be a nutrition expert to choose my grocery bags each week. I can consult experts. I can look up information online. And I think families would be in a better position and have a stronger incentive to look up things about educational quality if they had the power to make that choice. In the current system, it might be true that families don't look or do a lot of research into educational outcomes in schools. But there is a study that was published in 2018, I think it was by a couple of Cornell researchers, but they found that when school choice came into play, families started to research educational quality at different schools, online at least, which gives you some evidence to support that claim that once you have the power to choose, you're actually going to seek out more information. So I think that's the quick response there. But I really think this is one of the worst arguments against school choice. It's a paternalistic argument that I know better than you, and you're not capable of making these choices for your children. But I think families in general have a better incentive and information to get the decision right for their individual children. And if there is something that happens with neglect or abuse, as is today, then the government should step in after the effect. But we shouldn't punish 100% of parents because some small segment might make a bad decision. So we don't do that with any other industry either, and we don't punish everybody and assume everybody's guilty until proven innocent. It's the other way. We assume everybody's innocent until proven guilty, and then the government steps in.
So another common concern that people have about the idea of school choice, particularly education savings accounts or tuition vouchers, is that taxpayer money, so government funds, could go to explicitly religious institutions, including, for example, institutions that don't allow parents of same-sex couples to enroll, or that schools that fire gay teachers because they don't abide by that school's faith, So I guess the question here is, to what extent, why should people not view that as a roadblock, right? Because people would say, well, I don't want government money going to religious institutions because I believe in separation of church and state, or I don't want government money to going to schools that discriminate. Those are common beliefs, and whether rightly or wrongly, that's what they are. So how do you respond to them?
Yeah, my quick response is I ask those same people if they want to get rid of Pell Grants and pre-K programs, because Pell Grants can be used at religious universities. Pre-K programs are, again, taxpayer dollars that can be used at religious pre-K providers. And those same people don't make any of these arguments when it comes to pre-K or higher education. And again, the only difference is when it comes to K through 12, that threatens their monopoly. When it comes to these other levels of education, you don't have that same type of power dynamic that choice will threaten a monopoly. But a similar argument, I mean, the heart of this argument, I believe, it's a chapter in our book by Institute for Justice's Tim Keller, is that people will say that school choice is unconstitutional because those are public dollars that could be used at private religious schools. And their argument is that this is a separation of church and state issue, that this would violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, to which, again, I respond, well, do you think Pell Grants are unconstitutional because the money can be used at private religious schools or public schools? What about pre-K programs? What about food stamps that can be used to buy food that's ultimately consumed at a church or at a religious ceremony? Are food stamps therefore unconstitutional? And what about Medicaid dollars? Those can be used at Catholic or private Catholic hospitals. Does that make them unconstitutional? No. And the reason for that, the reason that all these other things are not unconstitutional when it comes to the Establishment Clause, at least, is that the money goes to the individual family, and the family is the primary beneficiary of those dollars, and they have a choice in the matter to take it to a public, private, religious, or non-religious provider of their choosing. And because there's that separation, there is no issue when it comes to the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And there's also been Supreme Court precedent on this. In 2002, the Zellman versus Simmons-Harris case ruled a 5-4 decision in favor of school choice. It was an Ohio voucher program, and it was the same argument. The money could be used at religious institutions. But the court ruled that because the family is the primary beneficiary, it's not an issue, just like it's not an issue with Pell Grants, pre-K programs, Medicaid, food stamps, all these other programs.
What about discrimination, though? If we're going to have taxpayer programs funding private schools, shouldn't they be bound by anti-discrimination laws?
Yeah, and people don't bring the same energy when it comes to the public schools, do they? You have a lot of public schools which, while they might not explicitly discriminate based on things like race, you have highly segregated traditional public schools, but you don't have people calling to defund and dismantle traditional public schools for that reason. And you do have explicit forms of discrimination when it comes to the public school system, and that is through zip code. If you don't live in a particular place, too bad, you don't get to go to the best public school in town. And so they do discriminate in different types of categories when it comes to the traditional public school system, and they do have selective admissions when it comes to magnet schools. And when it comes to private schools and other type forms of discrimination that private schools can legally participate in, that's an argument with whether private schools should have the right to exercise those types of admissions criteria or not. And then not all private schools have these types of discriminatory policies. So there are some private schools that don't. So for example, I think you wrote about this, Brad, in the Washington Examiner. A student named Elijah was using a private school choice program in Florida, and he was they were an LGBTQ identified student, and they said that the school choice program actually saved their life because of the discrimination that they were facing in the traditional public school system. So even if a public school on paper says that they're not discriminating against certain types of students, you could still have a public school that kind of does in the sense that there's not the best environment for that individual student. So nixing an entire program because some of the schools might have admission criteria that you don't like, one, makes it so that those students who would have otherwise benefited from other types of private schools wouldn't be able to access any of those schools. But then also other types of students who would, from other disadvantaged groups, who would have benefited from the schools with the policies that you don't like, could have benefited. And if you nix the program altogether, they won't be able to access those environments, and then they'll be stuck going to the original school that wasn't meeting their needs. And again, something I always like to point out is all of these arguments disproportionately affect the least advantaged. So you could nix a program and then have a private school still discriminating in a certain way that rich people are still able to access. So you're not really harming those types of schools all that much.
So I'll take my devil's advocate hat off for a bit and stop grilling you, Corey. You're a good sport. But let's talk a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic and how that has changed the conversation about school choice in public schools, because we've seen a really, in my view, unconscionable push by teachers' unions to keep schools closed despite ample scientific evidence showing schools are not hotbeds of COVID-19 transmission by any stretch. You've had parents trapped with kids at home, and distance learning has really failed. All sorts of horrible statistics about low-income and minority students falling behind. Is this going to give the school choice movement a serious liftoff? Are people finally seeing that the traditional system is broken because of the extreme situations that they've found themselves in?
Yes, this might be the only silver lining of the pandemic in 2020, that families are finally figuring out that there's no good reason to fund institutions when you can fund students directly instead. I mean, just look at the stark contrast between the private sector and the public sector over the past year. Private schools and other private businesses, restaurants and grocery stores and otherwise, and daycares, have been fighting to reopen, or they've been open for a very long time, whereas so many public schools and teachers unions have been fighting for the opposite. They've been fighting to remain closed. And I think the main difference is one of incentives. One of those sectors gets your money regardless of whether they open their doors for business. And so the way that I like to put it, and I think more and more people are seeing it this way, is that if your grocery store, for example, doesn't reopen, you can take your money elsewhere. It's not that huge of a deal. You don't have a national debate about whether my neighborhood Walmart open their doors or not, for example, because I could take my money to Trader Joe's or Whole Foods or another provider of the service. I think families are starting to realize that similarly, if their school doesn't reopen, they should be able to take their children's education dollars elsewhere, to a private school or another public school that chose to open, because the private schools have been more than happy to open their doors for business for students. In some places, I mean, you had in Kentucky and other places where the government was trying to prevent the private schools from reopening in person, the private schools didn't celebrate. I mean, in Kentucky, the teachers union celebrated that decision that all schools were closed. The response from the private sector was, oh, no, because they knew that families aren't, if you're not providing a service, the families are not going to just continue giving you money in perpetuity, regardless of the services that are being provided. So they knew that they had to cater to the needs of the families. And the best way to do that for their population of families was to open their doors for business. And so they even took the fight through the courts all the way up to the Supreme Court, all the way up to Kavanaugh, to try to reopen their doors for in-person instruction. We saw similar fights in Michigan and Ohio when the private schools were shut down, in Dane County, Wisconsin. You saw this everywhere. The teachers unions were really happy about it. Oh, thank you for listening to science, when in reality, the science showed that the schools were one of the safest places to reopen in person, but one of the last places to actually do so. And again, it's because of that messed up incentive structure that we have in the traditional public school system. It's not because the employees are bad people. It's because they can see they can make a cost benefit decision. And if they can keep their benefits the same, regardless of whether the level of work that they're performing and regardless of the risk that they are encountering, they're all else equal going to want to stay home and work from home. So it's not about intentions, it's about incentives. And And so I think more like so many people have seen this, and nationally, at first it was just anecdotes. It just seemed like the private schools are more likely to reopen than public schools. But there was a national survey that was reported on by Axios that found that only about 5% of private schools were remote only, all virtual, whereas about 62% of public schools nationwide were remote only, which means that the private schools are much more likely to be in person. I gathered data from San Diego. Only about 2% of the public schools were in person, or public school students were in person, but about 55% of private school students were in person in San Diego. And that held even after controlling for zip code, controlling for the size of the school, and other factors as well. Private schools are just a lot more likely to open in person. And so, families are seeing this. Families have always been getting the short end of the stick when it comes to K-12 education, but COVID really put a spotlight on it. The way I like to put it is that COVID didn't break the school system. It was already broken. It simply illuminated the problems and power imbalances that were already there. And so some evidence for this, that families are more likely to support school choice now, is that I was talking to you about one of the surveys before we started from Missouri, but I'll start with the national polls. One was from Real Clear Opinion Research that found that between April and August, support for funding students directly jumped by 10 percentage points, from 67% to 77% in a short period of time. And it's because families are seeing that they're getting a bad deal. They're really starting to realize it now. And then also EdChoice did a similar survey recently, finding at a national level that 81% of the general public supported funding students directly through education savings accounts. And that was a 4 percentage point jump from last year. And they broke it out by every different type: charter schools, vouchers, tax credit scholarships, ESAs. Every single type of school choice saw a huge jump from last year. And what's the main difference this year is that families really got to see that the public schools just aren't there for them this year. And in Missouri, the latest poll that actually just came out before we started, they asked the families, or it was the general voting population was who they sampled. And they found that families were now about twice as likely to support funding students directly as they are to oppose funding students directly. And they also asked families, how did you feel about your confidence in the public schools decision-making last year? And then how do you feel this year? And there was a huge drop in confidence in public schools from last year to this year, at least in Missouri. I think they're about half as likely this year to say that they're fully supportive of their public school, for example. So all these surveys are finding similar trends. And again, it might be the only silver lining of this thing, that families are seeing that we should fund students, not institutions or systems.
Yeah, look, not many silver linings of this last year and of 2020, but if the broken education system is finally getting dragged into the spotlight so people can see what it is and embrace reform, that will be a good thing. But now, Corey, it is time for everybody's favorite part of the show, where we drag your food takes into the spotlight. So go ahead and lay on the audience what your most controversial food opinion is.
Well, it's certainly not that steak is good with ketchup. I read your thread on this. I do agree with you, though, that soda isn't worth the calories.
It's not.
Why not just eat something instead of drinking your calories through soda?
I'd rather have some candy.
Yeah, come on. I don't really have controversial food takes. I can just say if I agree with yours or not. Chick-fil-A, I think, is pretty good. I have Chick-fil-A pretty often. You think it's overrated. Mm-hmm. Other than that, you gave me a heads up before the show to think about this, but I don't think I have any controversial. I like bacon. You don't like bacon as much as sausage, for example, but I think I have pretty middle of the road food takes.
All right. Well, middle of the road food takes, but sharp school choice analysis. That is Corey DeAngelis, everybody. Corey, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Brad.
You are listening to Breaking Boundaries with Brad Palumbo.